The heavy October fog lay thick over London, muffling the distant sound of hooves on cobblestone and the faint cries of the Thames boatmen. The morning was one of those particularly dreary affairs where even the city's gas lamps could scarcely penetrate the gloom. I had settled into my chair at 2-1B Baker Street, my newspaper in hand, when I noticed Holmes lounging on the settee. His long fingers steepled, his sharp gaze lost in the ceiling's intricate plasterwork. It was in such moments of silence that I often found myself unsettled, for Sherlock Holmes was never truly at rest. If he was not speaking, then his mind was undoubtedly constructing elaborate theories upon unseen foundations. The peace of the morning was shattered by the sound of hurried footsteps upon the stairs. A moment later, the door burst open, revealing Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard, his thin face unusually animated. His coat was damp from the mist outside, and his hat, hastily removed, was clutched in one hand. "Holmes," said, without preamble, "we have a most singular case." Holmes tilted his head slightly. "Then, by all means, Lestrade, do enlighten us." I was beginning to fear that crime had taken a holiday. Lestrade scowled, but did not rise to the bait. "A body's been found in Hyde Park, but that's not the strange part." Holmes exhaled. "A corpse is hardly a novelty in London, Lestrade. Tell me what piques your interest, or else I shall return to my studies." Lestrade stepped forward. "The body vanished, Holmes." That was enough to stir my interest. I set down my newspaper. "Vanished?" Lestrade nodded, his expression grim. "A constable on patrol found a man's body at dawn, middle-aged, well-dressed, no sign of a struggle, out. But by the time Scotland Yard arrived, it was gone." Holmes rose to his feet with sudden energy. "Ah, now we have something." He grabbed his coat from the nearby stand. "Watson, your hat. We leave at once." Lestrade blinked. "You'll take the case, then?" Holmes smirked. "Lestrade, you present me with a corpse that refuses to stay put. How could I not?" The fog had thickened by the time we reached Hyde Park, wrapping around the trees like spectral arms. The constable who had first discovered the body stood nervously beside a pair of his colleagues, who were now guarding the very spot where the corpse had last been seen. The ground was damp, the scent of wet earth lingering in the air. Holmes crouched and examined the patch of grass carefully. He ran his gloved fingers over the ground, his expression impassive. "Describe the body," he instructed the constable. The young man swallowed. "'K gentleman, sir. Well-dressed, dark suit, boots polished. No blood that I could see. Looked like he'd just laid down and died," Holmes muttered under his breath. "Fascinating." I crouched beside him. "Any footprints?" Holmes gestured to a faint impression in the damp soil. "Yes, Watson, but not of the man himself." His fingers traced the outline of something barely visible in the mud, rather the marks of those who moved him. Lestrade, standing nearby, frowned. "You're certain he was moved?" Holmes stood, brushing his hands together. "The body was found here, yet there are no signs of struggle. No footprints consistent with a man collapsing unexpectedly. That tells us two things. First, he was placed here post-mortem, and second, straightened, his sharp gaze locking onto Lestrade. Whoever moved him was careful, very careful." Lestrade crossed his arms. "But why? Who steals a corpse from a crime scene?" Holmes glanced around the fog-laden park, his mind already moving far beyond the present moment. "Someone who does not wish the body to be found in this location." He turned to the constable. "Did you recognize the man?" The young officer hesitated. "No, sir, but I checked his pockets before running to report it." Holmes' eyebrows lifted in interest, and the constable reached into his own pocket and produced a small slip of parchment. This was in his coat. Holmes took the note and held it up to the dim light. Written in elegant but hurried script were the words, "Drury Lane, Midnight. Come alone, Lestrade muttered. A curse? Drury Lane. That's the theater district. Why in blazes would a dead man have a meeting there? Holmes merely smiled. That, Lestrade, is precisely what we intend to find out. It was late evening when we arrived in Drury Lane, the gas lamps casting long, flickering shadows across the narrow streets. Holmes led the way with his characteristic purpose, sharp eyes scanning every doorway, every passerby. As we approached the entrance of a small lodging house, a nervous-looking landlady met us at the door. "You hear about the body, then?" she asked in a hushed voice. I felt a shiver of unease. "Another body." The woman wrung her hands. "Well, I suppose it's the same one." Holmes' expression sharpened. "Explain." The landlady hesitated, then motioned for us to follow her inside. She led us to the front hall, where, lying just beside the stairwell, was the body of a well-dressed man. "The same body." Lestrade inhaled sharply. "It's him." I stepped forward and knelt beside the corpse, my pulse quickening. "No doubt, it's the same man who vanished from Hyde Park." Holmes' eyes gleamed with something dangerously close to satisfaction. "Then, gentlemen, we must ask ourselves, who wished for him to be found here instead?" A tense silence followed. Lestrade exhaled. "Someone's playing games with us." Holmes smiled faintly. "Indeed. And I do love a good game." We stood in the dimly lit hallway of the Drury Lane lodging house. The body of the missing man sprawled unnervingly at our feet. The very corpse that had vanished from Hyde Park that morning now lay before us once more, as if deposited by unseen. Hans Holmes crouched beside it, his keen eyes moving over every detail with a precision that seemed almost surgical. Lestrade, standing stiffly behind him, rubbed his forehead in frustration. "Well, I'll say it plainly," the inspector muttered. "I don't like it." Holmes did not look up. An astute observation. Lestrade scowled. "Come off it, Holmes. This isn't a normal case. If we find a body, it disappears. Hours later, it turns up in a completely different part of the city." He crossed his arms. "How do you explain that?" Holmes finally stood, brushing the dust from his trousers. "The explanation, Lestrade, is as simple as it is methodical." He gestured toward the body. "Someone moved him. The question is, why?" I knelt beside the corpse and began a careful medical examination. The man's finely tailored suit was undisturbed, save for a single button undone at his waistcoat. No obvious wounds, no visible signs of violence. Just as he had been found in Hyde Park. Holmes tapped his fingers against his chin. "Watson, your professional opinion." I pressed my fingers to the man's wrist, noting the stiffness of his limbs. "Rigor mortis is setting in, but it's at an earlier stage than expected." I frowned. "He's colder than he should be." Lestrade raised a brow. "Colder?" Nodded. "If he truly died sometime last night, his body should still be retaining some heat. But this," I gestured toward the corpse, "it's as though he's been exposed to unnatural cold." Holmes' eyes gleamed. "Excellent, Watson." Lestrade frowned. "I don't see how that helps us." Holmes exhaled, his voice carrying an air of amusement. "'Cause it tells us that this man was not left in Hyde Park immediately after death. Hey, his body was stored somewhere first." Lestrade blinked. "Stored? It means someone kept a dead man locked away before dumping him in Hyde Park." Holmes gave a slow nod. "Precisely. And if we can determine where he was kept, we will begin to understand who wanted him to be found." Lestrade ran a hand through his thinning hair. "Devil take it, Holmes. This is turning into a blasted puzzle." Holmes turned his gaze back to the corpse. "A puzzle, yes, but one with a solution." The landlady, Mrs. Finch, watched us nervously as we straightened from our examination of the body. The small parlor where she had led us was cramped and dimly lit. the fireplace barely casting enough light to keep the shadows at bay. Holmes studied her for a moment before speaking. "Mrs. Finch, I understand that you discovered the body this evening?" The woman nodded, wringing her hands. "Why, yes, sir. Just before 7. I went out to sweep the steps, and there he was, lying at my door." She shuddered. "Gave me a fright. It did." Holmes steepled his fingers. "Did you hear or see anything unusual before finding him?" Mrs. Finch hesitated. "Well, it was something." Lestrade leaned forward. "Go on." The landlady licked her lips. "About an hour before I found the body, I heard something outside. A cart, I think, just for a moment, and then," she shivered. "It was like someone dropped a heavy bundle." Oh, nodded approvingly. "A corpse being deposited, perhaps?" Lestrade narrowed his eyes. "So someone deliberately placed him here." Holmes smiled faintly. "Someone who wished for him to be found." Mrs. Finch hesitated again. "There's something else." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "When I went out there," she continued in a hushed tone, "I thought I saw someone watching from across the street. Just for a second. A man standing in the alley." Lestrade frowned. "Did you see his face?" She shook her head. "No, sir. It's just a shadow." "Huh. But it was like he wanted to make sure I found the body." Holmes turned to me, his expression unreadable. "Watson, it seems we have not one mystery, but two. Not only must we determine who this man was, but also who wished for him to be found and why." I sighed. "And how do you propose we begin?" Holmes smirked. "By following the trail before it grows cold." "Okay." As we stepped outside, Lestrade caught Holmes' arm. "Look here, Holmes. I know you enjoy these games, but we've got a real mess on our hands." Holmes arched a brow. "You disapprove of our course of action?" Lestrade exhaled sharply. "I don't like mysteries that play themselves out like ghost stories. It's unnatural, Holmes. Bodies, moving, messages left behind. It feels like someone's toying with us." Holmes' gaze sharpened. "Then let us ensure that we are the ones solving the game, rather than playing into it." Lestrade folded his arms. "That if I have my own ideas about this case." Holmes smirked. "Okay. Then I welcome the challenge, Inspector." For a moment, Lestrade looked as if he might argue, but then he simply sighed. "Fine, but mark my words, Holmes, I'm not going to sit on the sidelines." This time, Holmes gave him an approving nod. "Good. Then we shall see who reaches the truth first." I watched their exchange with interest. It was rare for Lestrade to assert himself in such a manner, but in doing so, he had unknowingly fallen right into Holmes' method, turning the case into a competition. And if there was one thing Sherlock Holmes thrived upon, it was the thrill of proving himself right. As we departed Drury Lane, Holmes turned to me. "Watson, we have 2 points of interest now. The first is Hyde Park, where the body was placed. The second is wherever it was stored. Before then," I frowned. "And how do you propose to find that location?" Holmes smiled. "Elementary. We need only look at the state of the body, its temperature, the lack of decay. This tells us that it was kept somewhere cold." Lestrade, who had been listening, frowned. "A morgue." Holmes shook his head. "Oh, if it had been stored in a city mortuary, someone would have noticed. But a private location perhaps, a warehouse or an ice house now, that is a possibility." I sighed. "So, where do we begin?" As Holmes adjusted his coat and hailed a hansom cab. "By asking the right people the right questions." As we climbed into the carriage, I felt a strange unease settle over me. The mystery of the wandering corpse was deepening and I had the distinct impression that we were only at the beginning of a much larger, far more dangerous game. Holmes, however, merely smiled. "The night is young, Watson. Again the hunt has just begun." The streets of London were thick with fog as Holmes, Lestrade, and I rode toward the city mortuary where the body from Drury Lane had been taken. The mystery had grown increasingly perplexing. What had begun as a single death had now expanded into something far more elaborate. Lestrade sat across from us in the carriage, his arms folded, his expression one of open skepticism. "You're leading us in circles, Holmes. A body moves from Hyde Park to Drury Lane, and now you tell me it was stored somewhere in between?" Holmes, who had been gazing out the window, turned to him with mild amusement. "Lestrade, if crime were as linear as you wish it to be, I would be out of work." Lestrade scowled. "That's not what I meant." Holmes steepled his fingers. "Then let me pose you a question. If our victim died before being placed in Hyde Park, and if his body showed signs of unusual cold, where would you expect to find answers?" Lestrade hesitated, then grumbled, "Somewhere with access to refrigeration." Holmes nodded approvingly. "Precisely. And, if I am not mistaken, we shall soon have our proof." I frowned. "Proof?" Holmes simply smiled. The London City Mortuary was a grim, sterile place where the scent of antiseptic did little to mask the underlying presence of death. The head mortician, a wiry man named Dr. Elliot Graves, greeted us with a professional nod. "You're here for the Drury Lane body," he said, already leading us toward a cold examination room. "A most peculiar case, gentlemen." Holmes gestured for him to continue. Graves stopped by the covered corpse and folded his arms. "The cause of death is not immediately apparent. No wounds, no signs of struggle. However," he lifted the sheet, revealing the man's pallid face. His body temperature was far lower than expected upon arrival, almost as though he had been frozen. Lestrade exhaled sharply. "Frozen." I stepped forward, examining the body myself. The skin still retained an unnatural stiffness, the kind that only prolonged exposure to extreme cold could cause. Holmes leaned in slightly. "Tell me, Dr. Graves, were there any markings on the body?" The mortician nodded. "Yes, in fact." He carefully turned the man's wrist, revealing a faint pressure mark, as if something had been tied around it. Holmes' eyes gleamed. As I suspected, Lestrade's patience had clearly run thin. "Enough with the riddles, Holmes. Just say it outright." Holmes straightened, his voice taking on that crisp, decisive tone I had come to associate with his greatest deductions. "This man was bound at some point after death, likely suspended by his wrists, and the unnatural cold suggests that he was kept in an ice house before being moved to Hyde Park." Lestrade's eyes widened slightly. "An ice house?" Holmes nodded. "Yes, Lestrade. The kind used to store perishables or, in this case, a corpse." I exhaled. "Think someone wanted to keep the body preserved before moving it." Holmes turned toward Lestrade. "What does that tell us?" Lestrade hesitated, but then realization dawned. "It means whoever killed him had a reason to delay the discovery." Holmes smiled. "Exactly. Which means the crime was not an impulsive act, it was premeditated." Lestrade scratched his chin. "So, we're dealing with someone who had access to an ice house, the means to transport a body across London, and the desire to stage the scene." Holmes gave an approving nod. "You're thinking like a detective, Lestrade." Lestrade scowled. "Don't patronize me, Holmes." Holmes smirked. "I wouldn't dream of it." With our newfound knowledge, we left the mortuary and made our way to the warehouses along the Thames, where many ice houses operated to preserve shipments of meat and fish. Lestrade had taken the lead, speaking with various dock workers while Holmes and I observed the surroundings. The air was thick with the scent of brine, the distant sound of waves lapping against the docks filling the silence between our exchanges. After nearly an hour, Lestrade returned, his expression a mix of frustration and triumph. "Well, you were right about the ice house, Holmes. One of the night watchmen reported something odd." Holmes' eyes gleamed. "Go on." Lestrade produced a small ledger book and flipped it open. According to the records, a private shipment of ice was received 2 nights ago at Westminster. Ice in storage, but here's the odd part. The delivery wasn't for perishable goods. I raised an eyebrow. Then what was it for? Lestrade's expression darkened. A wooden crate, large enough to fit a body inside. I inhaled sharply. Holmes' voice was a whisper of satisfaction. Now we are getting somewhere. We arrived at Westminster Ice and Storage just as the evening fog rolled in from the river. The warehouse was a looming structure, its interior chilled by massive ice blocks stacked along the walls. The foreman, a burly man named Henry McAllister, met us at the entrance, his expression wary. "You lot are asking about the crate, aren't you?" Lestrade stepped forward. "You knew it was suspicious." McAllister nodded. "The fellow who rented the space was nervous, wouldn't give his real name, paid in cash." Holmes interjected. "Describe him." McAllister hesitated. Middle-aged, well-dressed, but not a gentleman. More like a businessman on hard times. Had a scar near his left eye. Lestrade's eyes narrowed. "That matches the description of Samuel Arkwright." I frowned. "Who's Arkwright?" Lestrade exhaled. "He's an investor with a bad reputation, been in and out of trouble over the years. But here's the thing." He turned to Holmes. "Arkwright had dealings with Reginald Wexley." A chill ran down my spine. "The man who was murdered?" Lestrade nodded. "And now Arkwright is moving bodies around in ice houses." Holmes smiled thinly. "Then I believe we have our next visit planned." As we left the warehouse, the case had taken on an undeniable shape. A body, preserved in ice, had been deliberately staged. The man responsible for renting the ice house was Samuel Arkwright, an associate of the first victim, Wexley. The pattern suggested a crime larger than a single murder. It suggested a conspiracy. As we climbed into our carriage, I turned to Holmes. "Do you truly believe Arkwright is our killer?" Holmes exhaled. "Not necessarily, Watson. But he knows far more than he is letting on." Lestrade tightened his jaw. "Then let's make him talk." Holmes smiled. "Indeed." And with that, we set off toward the next piece of the puzzle, knowing full well that we were only beginning to unravel the real mystery behind the wandering corpse. 4. Samuel Arkwright's secrets. The hansom cab rattled through the misty streets of London as we made our way to Samuel Arkwright's residence. The air carried the scent of damp stone and coal smoke, and the gas lamps flickered like spectral sentinels against the creeping fog. Lestrade sat across from Holmes and me, flipping through his notebook with a furrowed brow. "Let's go over it again. We have 2 dead men Wexley and our mystery corpse. And now we've got Samuel Arkwright renting space in an ice house to hide a body." He snapped the notebook shut. "So what's his role in all of this?" Holmes, reclining against the seat with his long fingers steepled, merely smiled. "It's precisely what we intend to ask him." Lestrade exhaled sharply. "I don't like this, Holmes. Something's off." Holmes tilted his head slightly. "And why is that?" Lestrade hesitated. "Because Arkwright is a coward." I raised an eyebrow. "A coward?" Lestrade nodded. "He's a schemer, sure, but he doesn't have the stomach for murder. He's the type to bribe and blackmail, not kill." Holmes' eyes gleamed. "Then, if he did not kill, why is he hiding the body?" Lestrade muttered a curse. "That's what we're about to find out." Holmes tapped his fingers against his knee. "Indeed." The carriage slowed, and as we stepped onto the pavement, Kai took in a sight of Arkwright's residence, well-maintained Kai's townhouse tucked away in a quieter part of the city. It was not the home of a man drowning in wealth, but rather one who had learned to live just below the scrutiny of the upper class. Holmes glanced at Lestrade. "Shall we?" Lestrade knocked sharply, and after a long pause, the door opened. A butler, stiff and wary, regarded us. Double quotes, "Mr. Arkwright is not receiving visitors." Lestrade pushed past him with an air of authority. He is now. The butler looked scandalized, but Holmes merely followed, his sharp gaze already scanning the interior. I, as ever, trailed behind, bracing myself for what was to come. Samuel Arkwright was not the man I expected him to be. We found him in his study, slouched in an armchair, a glass of brandy trembling in his hand. His face was gaunt, his once polished suit slightly disheveled. He looked not like a man at the height of his schemes, but one standing upon the precipice of disaster. He barely glanced at us as we entered. "Lestrade," he murmured, taking a slow sip of his drink. "And you?" His eyes flickered toward Holmes. "I was wondering when you'd come." Holmes smiled faintly. "You expected us?" Arkwright let out a dry laugh. "Of course. Body goes missing, turns up again, and then someone starts whispering my name." "How long did it take you to find the ice house?" Lestrade stepped forward, his voice firm. "We're past that, Arkwright. You rented space to store a corpse. Tell us why." Arkwright exhaled slowly, setting his glass down with deliberate care. "'Cause I was told to." A silence followed. Holmes' expression remained unreadable. "Told to? By whom?" Arkwright hesitated. Lestrade's patience was wearing thin. "Damn it, man. Answer." Arkwright flinched, then rubbed a hand across his face. "I don't know." Lestrade blinked. "You don't know?" Arkwright let out a strained chuckle. "That's the problem, isn't it? I received a message, same as Wexley." Holmes narrowed his eyes. "Explain." Arkwright hesitated, then reached into his desk, retrieving a folded piece of parchment. He tossed it onto the table. Holmes picked it up and unfolded it. The words, scrawled in dark ink, were simple but chilling. "The past is not buried. The debt is not paid." Lestrade muttered a curse. Another bloody message. Holmes turned the note over, inspecting the edges. "And when did you receive this?" Arkwright swallowed. 3 nights ago." I felt a chill. "The night before the body appeared in Hyde Park." Holmes nodded, his mind racing ahead. "And what did you do?" Kaya exhaled sharply. "I did what I was told. The instructions came later. Leave space at the ice house available. Don't ask questions, and wait." Lestrade scowled. "And you complied?" Arkwright let out a humorless laugh. "Wouldn't you? Look at Wexley. The moment I got the letter, I knew I was being warned. If I refused, I'd be next." Holmes studied him for a moment. "You truly have no idea who was behind this?" Arkwright hesitated. "I have a suspicion." Lestrade straightened. "Go on." Arkwright licked his lips. "I think it's Blackwood." The room fell into a heavy silence. I felt my breath catch. "Blackwood." Arkwright nodded, his voice quieter now. "It has to be. He was the only one with reason, the only one with the right to come back." Lestrade's jaw clenched. "Edwin Blackwood is dead." Arkwright gave a hollow laugh. "Was the man in Hyde Park. That didn't stop him from turning up again, did it?" Holmes' expression remained unreadable. "You believe it's Blackwood?" Arkwright ran a hand through his hair. "What I believe doesn't matter. The man's dead. Yes, but someone is using his name. And that means they want us to believe it." Holmes tapped a finger against the note. "Which means the real question is why." Lestrade rubbed his temples. "So, we've got a dead man's name being used to terrify old business partners. A missing corpse that reappeared, and now Arkwright, who claims he was forced into this." He sighed heavily. "Holmes, tell me you see a way through this." Holmes smiled faintly. "Oh, I see the path, Lestrade. But we have yet to meet the true architect of this game." Lestrade frowned. "And how do we do that?" Holmes folded the note and tucked it into his coat. "By forcing their hand." Arkwright stiffened. "What do you mean?" Holmes turned toward the window, gazing into the fog. "You were given instructions to follow. Now We shall issue some of our own. I frowned. What are you suggesting? Holmes smiled, and there was something almost dangerous in his expression. We let the mastermind believe their plan is working, and then his eyes gleamed. We set a trap. V. Holmes, Gambit, and the man in the shadows. The fog clung to the gaslit streets as we made our way back to 2-1B Baker Street. The revelations from our meeting with Samuel Arkwright swirling in my mind like the mist around us, I think. The notion that someone, possibly Blackwood himself, or another shadowy figure, was orchestrating a campaign of fear and manipulation was disturbing. Lestrade walked alongside us, his frustration palpable. Holmes, tell me straight, do you believe Blackwood is alive? Holmes didn't break stride. Twat out of Lestrade is irrelevant. What matters is that someone wishes for you to believe it. Lestrade scowled. So we're chasing a ghost, then. Holmes gave a knowing smile. A ghost who leaves very real bodies in his wake. The warm glow of our sitting room was a stark contrast to the chill outside. Holmes moved to his desk, retrieving a fresh sheet of parchment. He dipped his pen in ink and began writing. I leaned forward. Holmes, what are you doing? He did not look up, issuing a reply. Lestrade frowned. To whom? Holmes finished the letter with a flourish, sealed it, and held it up to the light. To our mysterious puppeteer. Lestrade looked exasperated. Can't, pray tell, do you plan to deliver a letter to a man we don't even know exists? Holmes smirked. By ensuring it reaches the right hands. He turned to me. Watson, be so kind as to read aloud the message we found in Arkwright's desk. I retrieved the slip of paper and read, The past is not buried. The debt is not paid. Holmes nodded. Now, here is my reply. He took the letter from his desk and read aloud. The debt will be settled. The past will be laid to rest. Come to the old warehouse at the docks at midnight if you wish to collect. Lestrade's brow furrowed. You're setting a trap. Holmes' smile was razor sharp. Indeed, I frowned. But how do you know they'll take the bait? Holmes turned the letter over in his fingers. 'Cause whoever orchestrated this has been controlling the game from the shadows. They will not ignore a move that suggests one of their pawns are Crites attempting to turn against them. Lestrade crossed his arms. And if they sent another messenger instead of revealing themselves? Holmes slipped the letter into an envelope. Then we shall be waiting. The warehouse by the Thames was a vast, hollow structure of rusted iron and rotting wood. The sound of the river lapping against the stone embankment filled the night air as we waited in the shadows. Holmes stood at the center of the open space, his sharp eyes watching the darkened entrance. Lestrade and I were concealed behind a stack of crates, revolvers at the ready. A squad of Scotland Yard officers waited just outside, prepared to move in at Holmes' signal. Minutes passed, then a faint shuffle of footsteps. Lestrade tensed, beside me, gripping his revolver. Someone's coming. A lone figure stepped into the dim light of the warehouse, tall, cloaked in darkness, moving with the slow confidence of a man who feared nothing. Holmes did not flinch as the figure approached. You received my message, then? The man stepped forward, and as the lantern light fell upon his face, I saw a pale scar running from his left eye to his jawline. His cold, intelligent gaze was unreadable. This was no messenger. This was the man orchestrating the entire affair. Holmes tilted his head. I take it you are the one who has been sending the warnings. The man's lips curled into something resembling a smile. Perhaps. Lestrade stepped forward, revolver raised. Who are you? The man did not look at him. His gaze remained fixed on Holmes. Holmes exhaled. You are neither a ghost nor a victim of revenge, are you? The man chuckled. No, Mr. Holmes. I am something far worse. Holmes folded his arms. Then let us dispense with the theatrics. You manipulated Wexley, Arkwright, and Harker into believing they were being haunted by Edwin Blackwood. You orchestrated a campaign of fear, knowing that their paranoia would either drive them into your hands or to their own ruin. The man's smile did not waver, and yet it worked, did it not? Lestrade took a step forward, his grip tightening on his revolver. Enough games. What's your name? For the first time, the man's expression shifted slightly. You may call me Marius Quinn. Holmes nodded, as if the name confirmed his suspicions. Quinn, an enforcer, formerly employed by the East India Trading Syndicate. A man who deals in influence, not brute force. Quinn inclined his head slightly. Very good, Mr. Holmes. I swallowed. But why? Why go to such lengths? Quinn exhaled, as though bored of the conversation. 'Cause Blackwood was a fool. He fought to protect his name, to preserve his ideals. But men like Wexley, Arkwright, and Harker, they do not fear the law. They fear what they cannot control. Holmes nodded slowly. And so, you gave them something to fear. Quinn's smile was razor sharp. Precisely. Lestrade's patience had reached its end. You're under arrest. Quinn's eyes flickered toward Lestrade. My? Holmes' voice was calm. Yes, Quinn, you are. At his signal, the Scotland Yard officers emerged from the shadows. Within moments, Quinn was surrounded. The enforcer remained unerringly composed as the officers seized him. You mistake me for a common criminal, Inspector, but I am merely the messenger. Holmes watched him carefully. Then tell me who sent you. Quinn chuckled. Oh, Mr. Holmes, you already know that. He allowed himself to be led away, disappearing into the night, back at 221B Baker Street. Holmes stood by the window, gazing out into the foggy streets. I sat in my chair, still unsettled. Holmes, who did send Quinn? Holmes did not turn. The same man who always lingers just beyond the edge of our reach. I frowned. Holmes exhaled softly. Perhaps, or perhaps another. Someone who profits from these games of fear and deception. Lestrade, still brooding, exhaled sharply. So Quinn was just a tool, and the real mastermind remains free. Holmes turned to us, his expression unreadable. Yes, Lestrade. But the true mastermind is always the one who benefits most. I swallowed. And who is that? Holmes smiled, faintly. That, my dear Watson, is what we must yet discover. And so the case was far from over. The morning fog was still clinging to the rooftops when Lestrade arrived at 221B Baker Street. Looking as though he had not slept, his coat was damp from the mist, and his expression was dark with frustration. Holmes, who had been seated in his usual place with a pipe in hand, glanced up lazily. Lestrade, you look positively haunted. Lestrade ignored the remark and threw a newspaper onto the table. Quinn's been locked up overnight. He's not talking. Holmes exhaled a thin ribbon of smoke. Of course he isn't. I picked up the newspaper and scanned the front page. City in panic. Is Edwin Blackwood alive? The headline was printed in bold letters, and below it, an account of how Wexley and Arkwright had both met suspicious ends after receiving cryptic warnings. I set the paper down. Whoever's behind this, they want London to believe Blackwood has returned. Lestrade scowled, and they're succeeding. He leaned forward, bracing himself against the mantel. Holmes, we need something solid. You said last night that Quinn was just a pawn. That means there's someone pulling the strings. Holmes nodded. Tell me, Lestrade, who benefits most from the fear that has gripped the city? Lestrade frowned. I suppose whoever is orchestrating this. Holmes smiled faintly. Correct, but let us be more specific. Who benefits financially? Lestrade's brow furrowed. You're thinking of the East India Trading Syndicate? Holmes stood, his eyes gleaming. Precisely. The company was already under scrutiny before Blackwood's death. His disappearance allowed certain individuals, Wexley, Arkwright, and Harcourt, to profit greatly from his absence. But now, someone is leveraging the fear of his return for their own purposes. I frowned. You believe this isn't just revenge, it's business? Holmes nodded. And that means our true adversary is not a specter, but a man who stands to gain. Lestrade exhaled sharply. So, where do we start? Holmes smiled. We pay a visit to the one man who always profits from chaos. The offices of the East India Trading Syndicate were located in a grand stone building overlooking the Thames, a place of commerce, power, and ruthless ambition. Holmes, Lestrade, and I stepped into the lavish reception hall, where clerks bustled about in hushed tones. Within minutes, we were led to a private office where Lord Tobias Acton, one of the company's highest-ranking directors, awaited us. He was a man in his late 50s, the polished demeanor and the cold, calculating eyes of a financier who had long since lost his soul to the ledgers. He did not rise as we entered, merely gesturing to the chairs before him. Mr. Holmes, Inspector Lestrade. His voice was smooth. I assume this visit pertains to the unfortunate news surrounding our former business partners. Holmes settled into his chair, his expression unreadable. You assume correctly? Lord Acton steepled his fingers. A dreadful affair. Reginald Wexley and Samuel Arkwright, both taken under mysterious circumstances. I suppose you are here because you believe the company is somehow involved. Lestrade leaned forward. Wexley, Arkwright, and Harker all profited after Blackwood's disappearance, and now someone is hunting them. Lord Acton's lips twitched in something resembling amusement. And you suspect a conspiracy? Holmes exhaled. I suspect something more practical, Lord Acton. Fear is a valuable commodity, and few understand that better than a businessman. Acton's gaze sharpened. I deal in trade, Mr. Holmes, not in shadows. Holmes smiled faintly. And yet, the death of Edwin Blackwood allowed certain members of your syndicate to rise in wealth and status. Now, a phantom has returned, shaking the very foundation upon which they built their success. The question is, who benefits from that fear? Lord Acton was silent for a moment. Then he chuckled. Clever theory, Mr. Holmes. But unless you have something more than speculation, I am afraid I have no reason to entertain your accusations. Holmes met his gaze evenly. Then allow me to offer something tangible. A man named Marius Quinn has been arrested. He is an enforcer who has been terrorizing the very men who betrayed Blackwood. And while he has refused to speak thus far, I imagine that will change once he realizes his employer has abandoned him. For the first time, a flicker of something crossed Acton's face. Not fear - calculation, Holmes continued, his voice smooth. I suspect Quinn did not act alone, and if I follow the money, I will find the hand that has been moving the pieces all along. Lord Acton exhaled, adjusting his cufflinks. You are an intelligent man, Mr. Holmes. Holmes inclined his head. And you are a man who knows when to abandon a sinking ship. So, tell me, will you help me solve this mystery, or shall I let Quinn speak to the yard first? Acton studied Holmes carefully. Then, with a thin smile, he reached for his desk drawer and retrieved a single sheet of paper. He slid it across the table. A list of payments, Acton murmured, authorized by a man who saw great opportunity in chaos. Lestrade picked it up, scanning the names. His eyes widened. Harker. Acton nodded. Cornelius Harker has been moving funds through shell accounts for months. I suspect he has been using Quinn as a weapon to clean up loose ends. I inhaled sharply. Harker, he was working against his old partners. Holmes exhaled slowly. Not revenge. Control. Harker saw Blackwood's disappearance as an opportunity. Now that rumors of his return have spread, Harker is eliminating anyone who might connect him to the truth. Okay. Lestrade muttered a curse. And if he's tying up loose ends, then he'll be next. Okay. Holmes stood. Then we must reach him before Quinn's real employer does. Lord Acton smirked. I suggest you hurry. A man like Harker knows when he's cornered. And a cornered man is a dangerous thing. The carriage rattled through the misty streets as we raced toward Cornelius Harker's estate. Lestrade reloaded his revolver. If Harker is behind this, he won't go quietly. Holmes exhaled. No, but he will go. I clenched my fists. And if we're too late, Holmes glanced at me. Then we will have one last corpse to examine. The fog thickened as we neared the grand estate, but something was wrong. A single lantern flickered on the steps. The front door was ajar. Lestrade swore. Damn it, Holmes, we're late. Holmes leapt from the carriage, his coat billowing behind him as we rushed up the steps. Inside, the house was eerily silent. And then, as he reached the study, a figure slumped over the desk. Cornelius Harker. His face was frozen in a mask of horror, his hand still gripping a half-drunk glass of brandy. No wounds, no signs of struggle. Lestrade cursed. Poison. I felt my stomach tighten, the same as Wexley and Arkwright. Holmes stepped forward, picking up a small slip of parchment beside Harker's hand. He read the words aloud. The debt is settled. The past is buried. A heavy silence followed. Lestrade turned to Holmes. It's over then. Holmes studied the note, his expression unreadable. Perhaps. I frowned. You don't sound convinced. Holmes exhaled, because the one who profits most has yet to be revealed. And as the fog curled around the mansion, I could not shake the feeling that somewhere, unseen, the true mastermind was still watching. The heavy scent of laudanum and brandy lingered in Cornelius Harker's study, mixing with the damp chill that had crept in through the open window. His lifeless body remained slumped over the desk, his face frozen in an expression of sheer horror. The small slip of parchment, bearing the ominous message, the debt is settled, the past is buried, sat in Holmes' gloved fingers. Lestrade stood beside him, his face grim. That's 3 of them gone now. Holmes, Wexley, Arkwright, and now Harker. He exhaled sharply. I suppose that means it's over. Holmes, however, did not move. Cass's keen eyes remained fixed on the note, his lips pressed into a thin line. Tell me, Lestrade, do you truly believe that? Lestrade shifted. Quinn's locked up. Harker was behind the payments, the threats, the killings. If he's dead, then so is the scheme. Holmes finally turned to face him. And yet, we did not catch the man who delivered this final message. Lestrade hesitated. You think someone else was involved? Holmes tucked the note into his coat. I think that this mystery has been layered with deception from the beginning. He gestured toward the body. Harker had ample reason to want his former associates eliminated. But does this strike you as the work of a man in control? I looked at the corpse again. No signs of struggle, no forced entry. And yet, his features were twisted in terror, as though death had arrived at his doorstep like a phantom. Holmes exhaled. No, this was not the work of a mastermind. This was the work of a pawn who believed himself to be the player. Lestrade frowned. Then who's behind it? Holmes turned to me. Watson, do you recall the most critical rule of finance? I furrowed my brow. Follow the money. Holmes smiled faintly. Exactly. He tapped a finger against the note in his pocket. And if we follow the money, I believe we shall find the true orchestrator. Lestrade crossed his arms. And where does that leave us? Holmes' eyes darkened. With one last name. One last debt to be paid. The hour was late when we emerged from Harker's estate. The thick London fog curled around the gas lamps, swallowing the light before it could fully illuminate the streets. Holmes walked with quick, deliberate strides, his mind already racing ahead of us. Lestrade kept pace. Where to now? Holmes. Didn't slow? Scotland Yard. Lestrade blinked. Why? Holmes turned his sharp gaze toward him. It's because Marius Quinn is still in your custody, and I intend to ask him a question. Lestrade frowned. Holmes, I told you Quinn hasn't said a word. Holmes gave a thin smile. Then he shall have no objection to listening. The cold iron bars of Scotland Yard's holding cells cast long, dark shadows across the stone floor. Marius Quinn sat on a simple wooden bench, his hands loosely shackled before him. He did not look up as we entered, though his lips curled into a smirk. Well, he drawled, if it isn't the great detective. Holmes ignored the remark and stepped forward. Harker is dead. Quinn's smirk faded, but he remained silent. Lestrade folded his arms. That means your employer no longer exists. Quinn chuckled softly. So you think I was working for Harker? He leaned forward slightly. You still don't get it, do you? Holmes' expression remained unreadable. Oh, I understand. Quinn, you were never his man. He reached into his coat and produced the note from Harker's desk, holding it up just beyond Quinn's reach. Quinn's eyes flickered toward it. Holmes lowered his voice. Tell me, Quinn, how does a man die? Of fear. Quinn exhaled, his smirk returning. Sometimes it's not about what you do. It's about what they believe you'll do. I felt a chill. Harker was poisoned. Quinn gave a slow nod. Was he? A long silence followed. Lestrade muttered a curse. Bloody hell. Holmes slipped the note back into his pocket. Fear is a powerful tool, Mr. Quinn, and someone wielded it expertly, who gave the final order. Quinn tilted his head. You already know. Holmes studied him for a moment longer, then turned away. That will be all. Lestrade stiffened. What? You're just going to let him sit there? Holmes glanced back. For now, he's already told me everything I need to know. Lestrade scoffed. He told you nothing. Holmes smiled faintly. Precisely. The hansom cab carried us back to Baker Street in silence. I could feel the weight of Holmes' thoughts as he stared out into the fog, his fingers tapping idly against his knee. Finally, I could bear it no longer. Holmes, who gave the final order. Holmes exhaled. The man who stood to gain the most. I frowned, but Harker was already benefiting. Holmes nodded. Indeed. But what happens when fear grips a company like the East India Trading Syndicate? Lestrade leaned forward. Investors panic. They sell. Holmes smiled. Thinly. And who buys? The answer came to me in a chilling instant. Lord Acton. Holmes gave a satisfied nod. Indeed, Watson. Acton allowed Harker to believe himself the mastermind, knowing full well that the fear he was spreading would eventually consume him. Lestrade exhaled sharply, so Acton set Harker up to take the fall. Holmes' gaze darkened. Not just Harker. All of them. He tapped his fingers against a carriage window. First Wexley, then Arkwright, then Harker. With each death, the company's stock dipped lower. Acton had but to wait, purchasing shares as the chaos unfolded. I felt a cold weight settle in my stomach, and when the time was right, Lestrade finished grimly. He let Harker believe he was next. Holmes nodded. Harker died in terror, believing he had been marked by the same ghost he helped create. Whether it was true poison or mere suggestion, the result was the same. Lestrade clenched his fists. Tan. Holmes sighed. On what charge? Instigating fear, manipulating the market. He shook his head. Lestrade. We cannot touch him. Lestrade's face twisted in frustration. So he wins. Holmes' gaze was distant. For now, back at Baker Street, Holmes stood at the window, watching the gas lamps flicker in the fog. I sat down, rubbing my temples. I hate cases like this. Holmes chuckled softly. As do I. Lestrade paced. There's got to be something we can do. Holmes finally turned. There is. Lestrade blinked. What? Holmes smiled. Wait. Lestrade frowned. That's your grand plan? Holmes exhaled, taking his seat by the fire. Men like Acton always overreach, Lestrade. One day, he will make a mistake, and when that day comes, I will be waiting. Lestrade muttered under his breath, but said nothing more. As the clock chimed midnight, I couldn't help but feel that, somewhere in the depths of London's shadows, Lord Acton was already planning his next move, and Holmes, ever patient, was waiting. The night after Cornelius Harker's death was unseasonably cold. A thick fog curled around the chimneys of London, swallowing the gas lamps before their light could reach the streets below. Holmes sat in his armchair at 221B Baker Street, his pipe smoldering in one hand, his gaze fixed upon the flickering embers in the hearth. Lestrade stood near the window, arms crossed. So that's it then, he muttered. We know Acton's behind it all, and yet we can't touch him. Holmes exhaled a thin ribbon of smoke. Not yet. Lestrade turned sharply. Not yet. Men are dead. Acton played us all for fools, orchestrated a campaign of fear, manipulated the stock market. And now he sits comfortably in his office while Scotland Yard is left grasping at air. Holmes smiled faintly. Precisely. Lestrade scowled. You're enjoying this? Holmes shook his head. No, Lestrade, but I am patient. Lestrade exhaled sharply. I don't have the luxury of patience, Holmes. We can't arrest Acton. Then we need something. A confession? A witness? Anything. Holmes tilted his head. And if I told you there was a man who could provide that? Lestrade narrowed his eyes. Then I'd ask why you've waited until now to tell me. Holmes leaned forward. 'Cause, my dear Lestrade, that man would not speak unless he's given reason to. I frowned. Who are you referring to? Holmes tapped his fingers against the arm of his chair. A man who has been at the center of this game from the very beginning. Silence hung in the room before Lestrade's eyes widened. Quinn. Holmes nodded. Precisely. Lestrade muttered a curse. You think he'll talk now? Holmes smiled. I think he'll talk when he understands that Acton never intended to leave him alive. Scotland Yard's holding cells were dimly lit. The stone walls damp from the ever-present chill of London's underground chambers. Marius Quinn, still dressed in his tattered coat, sat with his arms crossed, his face betraying no emotion. As we entered, he glanced up lazily. Ah, back again, are we? Stride pulled up a chair, placing it opposite Quinn with deliberate slowness. We need to talk. Quinn smirked. That's what you said last time. Holmes remained standing. But this time, Quinn, we are not here to question you about your actions. We are here to warn you. Quinn's smirk faltered ever so slightly. Warn me. Holmes' expression was unreadable. Tell me, how long do you think you'll last in that cell? Quinn chuckled, though the sound was hollow. You think I'm afraid of a few days in prison? Holmes shook his head. Nah. Prison, Quinn. What comes after? Lestrade leaned forward. You're a liability now. Acton doesn't leave liabilities. Quinn's jaw tightened, but he remained silent. Holmes continued. You carried out his orders, yes? But now, with Harker dead, Acton no longer needs you. He let the words settle before adding, and I suspect you know what he does with men he no longer needs. A long silence stretched between them. Quinn exhaled slowly. You don't have proof. Holmes smiled. Don't I? He reached into his coat and withdrew a small ledger book, one that had been retrieved from Acton's office during their earlier visit. He flipped it open to a marked page and laid it before Quinn. Quinn's eyes flickered over the text, smirk finally vanishing. Lestrade leaned forward. You recognize the handwriting, don't you? Quinn remained silent. Holmes tapped the page. Your name? Quinn. Right there, next to an unusually large sum of money. He turned the page. And on this one, a similar sum withdrawn just days ago, marked under severance. Lestrade's voice was low. That doesn't mean he's paying you off. This means he's paying to have you removed. Quinn's fingers clenched into fists. Holmes exhaled. You were a useful tool, Quinn, but now you are a loose end. A long silence followed. Quinn stared at the ledger for what felt like an eternity. Finally, he inhaled sharply and exhaled through his nose, like a man resigning himself to fate. Then, in a voice quieter than before, he muttered, What do you want to know? The next hour was spent carefully unraveling Lord Acton's scheme. Quinn explained how Khan had engineered the entire campaign, planting rumors, forging letters in Blackwood's name. Kane using Quinn to instill fear into Wexley, Arkwright, and Harker. The idea wasn't just to kill them, Quinn murmured. It was to make them destroy themselves. Wexley drank himself into a stupor, fearing he was cursed. Arkwright was so terrified he let himself be manipulated into silence. And Harker was always the easiest mark, the man thought himself. Clever, but he was just another piece on the board. Strayed scribbled furiously in his notebook. And Blackwood, is he ever involved? Quinn shook his head. No, as far as I know, the man died at sea. He let out a humorless chuckle, but Acton didn't need him to be alive. He just needed the idea of him to be alive. I swallowed, and you went along with it. Quinn exhaled. I thought I'd come out the other side with more money than I could count. His gaze darkened. Didn't realize I'd be buried with the rest. Holmes leaned forward. And now you understand, Quinn. Acton does not leave survivors. Quinn nodded, his expression grim. So what happens now? Lestrade snapped his notebook shut. Now you testify. Quinn scoffed. Against the Lord? You think that'll hold? Holmes smiled faintly. I think that, when combined with Acton's own records, it will be quite damning. Quinn hesitated. Then, finally, he nodded. Lestrade rose from his chair. Then it's time to bring down the Lord. By the following evening, Lord Tobias Acton was formally arrested on charges of fraud, conspiracy, and market manipulation. The news sent shockwaves through London's financial elite, and the East India Trading Syndicate was thrown into turmoil. Acton, ever the refined strategist, did not resist. He surrendered without protest, offering only a single remark as he was led away. Every empire falls eventually, Mr. Holmes. But men like me always build another. Holmes watched as Acton was taken into custody. Then I shall be waiting, Lord Acton. Back at Baker Street, I poured myself a brandy, letting out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. It's over then, Holmes smirked. For now, Lestrade, who had remained quiet since Acton's arrest, finally spoke. The city still believes Blackwood returned. Holmes nodded. Yes, and perhaps it is better that way. I frowned. Why? Holmes leaned back in his chair. 'Cause some ghosts, Watson, serve as warnings. His gaze flickered toward the fog outside. And as long as the myth of Edwin Blackwood lingers, there will be men who remember what happens to those who betray their own. Lestrade scoffed. You're saying fear still has its uses? Holmes exhaled. I am saying, Lestrade, that some stories are best left unsolved. The clock chimed midnight. Outside, the mist swallowed the city whole, and somewhere, unseen, the ghost of Edwin Blackwood still walked. The night after Cornelius Harker's death was unseasonably cold. A thick fog curled around the chimneys of London, swallowing the gas lamps before their light could reach the streets below. Holmes sat in his armchair at 221B Baker Street, his pipe smoldering in one hand, his gaze fixed upon the flickering embers in the hearth. Lestrade stood near the window, arms crossed. "So that's it then," he muttered. "We know Acton's behind it all, and yet we can't touch him." Holmes exhaled a thin ribbon of smoke. "Not yet." Lestrade turned sharply. "Not yet. Men are dead. Acton played us all for fools, orchestrated a campaign of fear, manipulated the stock market. And now he sits comfortably in his office while Scotland Yard is left grasping at air." Holmes smiled faintly. "Precisely." Lestrade scowled. "You're enjoying this?" Holmes shook his head. "No, Lestrade, but I am patient." Lestrade exhaled sharply. "I don't have the luxury of patience, Holmes. We can't arrest Acton. Then we need something. A confession? A witness? Anything." Holmes tilted his head. "And if I told you there was a man who could provide that?" Lestrade narrowed his eyes. "Then I'd ask why you've waited until now to tell me." Holmes leaned forward. "'Cause, my dear Lestrade, that man would not speak unless he's given reason to." I frowned. "Who are you referring to?" Holmes tapped his fingers against the arm of his chair. "A man who has been at the center of this game from the very beginning." Silence hung in the room before Lestrade's eyes widened. "Quinn." Holmes nodded. "Precisely." Lestrade muttered a curse. "You think he'll talk now?" Holmes smiled. "I think he'll talk when he understands that Acton never intended to leave him alive." Scotland Yard's holding cells were dimly lit. The stone walls damp from the ever-present chill of London's underground chambers. Marius Quinn, still dressed in his tattered coat, sat with his arms crossed, his face betraying no emotion. As we entered, he glanced up lazily. "Ah, back again, are we?" Stride pulled up a chair, placing it opposite Quinn with deliberate slowness. "We need to talk." Quinn smirked. "That's what you said last time." Holmes remained standing. "But this time, Quinn, we are not here to question you about your actions. We are here to warn you." Quinn's smirk faltered ever so slightly. "Warn me?" Holmes' expression was unreadable. "Tell me, how long do you think you'll last in that cell?" Quinn chuckled, though the sound was hollow. "You think I'm afraid of a few days in prison?" Holmes shook his head. "Nah. Prison, Quinn. What comes after?" Lestrade leaned forward. "You're a liability now. Acton doesn't leave liabilities." Quinn's jaw tightened, but he remained silent. Holmes continued. "You carried out his orders, yes? But now, with Harker dead, Acton no longer needs you." He let the words settle before adding, "And I suspect you know what he does with men he no longer needs." A long silence stretched between them. Quinn exhaled slowly. "You don't have proof." Holmes smiled. "Don't I?" He reached into his coat and withdrew a small ledger book, one that had been retrieved from Acton's office during their earlier visit. He flipped it open to a marked page and laid it before Quinn. Quinn's eyes flickered over the text, smirk finally vanishing. Lestrade leaned forward. "You recognize the handwriting, don't you?" Quinn remained silent. Holmes tapped the page. "Your name, Quinn, right there, next to an unusually large sum of money." He turned the page. "And on this one, a similar sum withdrawn just days ago, marked under severance." Lestrade's voice was low. "That doesn't mean he's paying you off. This means he's paying to have you removed." Quinn's fingers clenched into fists. Holmes exhaled. "You were a useful tool, Quinn, but now you are a loose end." A long silence followed. Quinn stared at the ledger for what felt like an eternity. Finally, he inhaled sharply and exhaled through his nose, like a man resigning himself to fate. Then, in a voice quieter than before, he muttered, "What do you want to know?" The next hour was spent carefully unraveling Lord Acton's scheme. Quinn explained how Khan had engineered the entire campaign, planting rumors, forging letters in Blackwood's name. Kane using Quinn to instill fear into Wexley, Arkwright, and Harker. The idea wasn't just to kill them, Quinn murmured. It was to make them destroy themselves. Wexley drank himself into a stupor, fearing he was cursed. Arkwright was so terrified he let himself be manipulated into silence. And Harker was always the easiest mark. The man thought himself clever, but he was just another piece on the board. Case Strayed scribbled furiously in his notebook. "And Blackwood, is he ever involved?" Quinn shook his head. "No. As far as I know, the man died at sea." He let out a humorless chuckle, but Acton didn't need him to be alive. He just needed the idea of him to be alive. I swallowed. "And you went along with it?" Quinn exhaled. "I thought I'd come out the other side with more money than I could count." His gaze darkened. "Didn't realize I'd be buried with the rest." Holmes leaned forward. "And now you understand, Quinn. Acton does not leave survivors." Quinn nodded, his expression grim. "So what happens now?" Lestrade snapped his notebook shut. "Now you testify." Quinn scoffed. "Against the Lord? You think that'll hold?" Holmes smiled faintly. "I think that, when combined with Acton's own records, it will be quite damning." Quinn hesitated. Then, finally, he nodded. Lestrade rose from his chair. "Then it's time to bring down the Lord." By the following evening, Lord Tobias Acton was formally arrested on charges of fraud, conspiracy, and market manipulation. The news sent shockwaves through London's financial elite, and the East India Trading Syndicate was thrown into turmoil. Acton, ever the refined strategist, did not resist. He surrendered without protest, offering only a single remark as he was led away. "Every empire falls eventually, Mr. Holmes, but men like me always build another." Holmes watched as Acton was taken into custody. "Then I shall be waiting, Lord Acton." Back at Baker Street, I poured myself a brandy, letting out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "It's over then," Holmes smirked. "For now." Lestrade, who had remained quiet since Acton's arrest, finally spoke. "The city still believes Blackwood returned." Holmes nodded. "Yes, and perhaps it is better that way." I frowned. "Why?" Holmes leaned back in his chair. "'Cause some ghosts, Watson, serve as warnings." His gaze flickered toward the fog outside. "'Kay, and as long as the myth of Edwin Blackwood lingers, there will be men who remember what happens to those who betray their own." Lestrade scoffed. "You're saying fear still has its uses?" Holmes exhaled. "I am saying, Lestrade, that some stories are best left unsolved." The clock chimed midnight. Outside, the mist swallowed the city whole, and somewhere, unseen, the ghost of Edwin Blackwood still walked. The discovery of Edwin Blackwood's empty grave had sent a shiver through all of us, but none more than Lestrade. He stood stiffly beside the overturned coffin at St. Mark's Cemetery, his jaw clenched, his breath shallow. "We caught Acton," he muttered, half to himself. "We proved a conspiracy. We should be done with this." Holmes, on the other hand, seemed energized by the revelation. "Kinda contrary, Lestrade," he murmured. "We are closer than ever to the truth." Lestrade exhaled sharply. "Holmes, if Blackwood's not here, then where is he?" Holmes turned, his gaze sharp. "That is precisely what we must find out." Back at 2-1B Baker Street, Holmes worked in silence, his long fingers sifting through his vast collection of notes. I sat nearby, watching him, strayed pace like a restless wolf, clearly waiting for Holmes to produce a miracle. Finally, Holmes, "Stop, Watson," he said, tapping a page. Remind me, how was Blackwood's death originally recorded? I frowned, thinking back. The ship he was on, the Argonaut, was caught in a storm off the Azores. It was presumed sunk, and there were no survivors. Holmes exhaled slowly. Yet we never saw a body. Lestrade scoffed. Holmes, that doesn't mean anything. Man lost at sea. Of course, there wouldn't be a body. Holmes tapped the desk. Ah, but there was a body, wasn't there? Sealed coffin arrived in London, and it was buried without inspection, without confirmation. It was merely assumed to be Blackwood. I felt my breath catch. You're saying the coffin never contained his remains at all? Holmes gave a knowing smile. Precisely. Lestrade shook his head. Then who the devil was buried instead? Holmes sighed. That is the wrong question. Lestrade frowned. Then, what's the right one? Holmes' voice was quiet, but firm. Who wanted Blackwood to disappear? We left Baker Street and made our way to the Port of London, where records of past voyages were kept. Holmes led the way to a small office by the docks, where an old shipping clerk sat hunched over his desk, half asleep. Holmes rapped on the counter. We require records on the Argonaut. The clerk blinked up at him. The Argonaut. He scratched his head. That ship went down 2 years ago. Holmes nodded. Yes, but what was her last registered cargo? The clerk muttered under his breath, but retrieved a thick ledger, flipping through yellowed pages. Finally, he ran a finger down a column. Here it is. The Argonaut departed for the Americas, carrying home goods from the East India Trading Syndicate. I tensed. Acton's company. Holmes smiled faintly. Indeed. Lestrade leaned over the desk. And survivors. Did anyone make it ashore? The clerk hesitated. Well, funny thing. That. Holmes' eyes gleamed. Go on. The clerk lowered his voice. There were rumors. The wreckage washed up near a Portuguese fishing village. Some say a man was pulled from the water. A heavy silence followed. Lestrade muttered a curse. Blackwood. Holmes exhaled. The past 2 years, gentlemen, McKay was never dead at all. By the time we reached a modest boarding house on the outskirts of London, at dawn, the fog had thickened, curling through the alleyways like silent watchers. Holmes knocked once, twice, a long pause. Then, slowly, the door opened. A man stood in the doorway, his sharp blue eyes shadowed by the brim of a worn hat. His face was leaner than before, the once aristocratic features weathered by time. His movements were deliberate, his gaze calculating. I felt my pulse quicken. Edwin Blackwood, Holmes offered. A faint smile. Ah, it is good to see you at last. Blackwood studied us carefully. You took your time, Mr. Holmes. His voice was steady, but I detected something beneath it, a weight, a weariness. Holmes stepped forward. The world believes you are dead. Blackwood smirked. Then the world is mistaken. Lestrade's grip tightened on his revolver. So you really did return? Blackwood exhaled. I did. Holmes tilted his head. And yet, rather than reclaim your life, you remained in the shadows. Why? Blackwood leaned against the doorframe. 'Cause I knew what awaited me if I returned. Holmes nodded. Acton Blackwood's expression darkened. He had me thrown onto that ship, Holmes. He wanted me dead. And when I survived, I realized something. Lestrade crossed his arms. And what's that? Blackwood exhaled. That sometimes a dead man is more powerful than a living one. A silence followed. Holmes studied him. You used your own myth. Blackwood gave a slow nod. I never needed to kill anyone. They did that to themselves. All I had to do was remind them of their sins. Lestrade muttered a curse. You were behind the letters, the rumors. Blackwood smirked. Wouldn't you be, if you had the chance? Holmes considered him for a long moment. Then, Quietly, he asked, "And what now, Blackwood?" Blackwood straightened. "Now, Acton is gone. My business is finished." Lestrade exhaled sharply. "You should be arrested." Blackwood smiled faintly. "For what, Inspector? I have committed no crime. I merely exist." Lestrade clenched his fists. "So what? Then you just vanish again?" Blackwood's smile did not fade, and in that moment, Kai understood. He had never returned to reclaim his life. He had returned only to ensure the men who wronged him were gone, and now his work was done. Holmes exhaled slowly. "If I were to look for you, Blackwood, would I find you?" Blackwood tilted his hat. "No, Mr. Holmes, you would not." Then, with a final glance toward the fog, he stepped back into the shadows and was gone. Back at 221B Baker Street, I stared into the fire, still shaken. Will we ever see him again? Holmes smirked. Ghosts tend to linger, Watson, but some prefer to remain unseen. Lestrade scowled. So that's it? We just let him go. Holmes exhaled. Would you rather he stayed? Lestrade muttered something under his breath, but said nothing more. The fire crackled. The fog curled outside the window. The case of Edwin Blackwood lingered in the air long after the final pieces had fallen into place. Lord Acton had been imprisoned, his empire shattered. The East India Trading Syndicate was under investigation. The city whispered of Blackwood's return, even as his name faded from official records. Yet, one question remained, one that neither Holmes nor I could fully answer. Was Edwin Blackwood a mastermind, or merely a man who had outlived his enemies? The fire at 221B Baker Street crackled gently as Holmes sat in his chair, lost in thought. I watched him from across the room, swirling my brandy, trying to settle my own unease. Lestrade, still brooding, from our encounter with Blackwood, stood by the window, arms crossed. "I can't believe we let him walk." Holmes exhaled. "Would you have preferred we dragged him to Scotland Yard, Lestrade?" Lestrade scoffed. "Under charge of being a damned ghost, Holmes. A man doesn't get thrown into the sea, disappear for years, and then return to drive his enemies to their deaths without some reckoning." Holmes smiled faintly. But that is precisely why he is beyond our grasp. You said it yourself, he didn't do anything. He simply was." Lestrade scowled. "That's not justice." Holmes turned toward him, his gaze sharp. "And yet, Lestrade, justice was done. Acton is in chains. His empire is finished. The men who betrayed Blackwood have all paid the price for their treachery, whether by the noose, the bottle, or their own fear. Tell me, does it truly matter if Blackwood himself struck the final blow?" Lestrade muttered something under his breath, but didn't argue. I took a slow sip of my drink. "Still, Holmes, there's something about it that unsettles me." Blackwood used his legend. He allowed men to destroy themselves with their own guilt. But was that his plan all along, or did he simply take advantage of what Acton had already set in motion? Holmes tapped his fingers against the armrest. Watson, that is the real mystery, isn't it?" I frowned. You don't know?" Holmes' eyes gleamed. "Oh, I have my suspicions. But certainty, that is another matter entirely." Lestrade exhaled, rubbing his face. "And what if he does come back? What? One day, we find another body with his name scrawled beside it?" Holmes smiled faintly. "Then, Lestrade, we will do as we always do. We will follow the clues." 3 weeks later, just as the city had begun to move on from the scandal, a letter arrived at Baker Street. It bore no sender's name. No return. Addressed. Holmes opened it with his usual efficiency, unfolding the crisp parchment with a flick of his fingers. His eyes scanned the message, his expression unreadable. I leaned forward. "Well, does it say?" Holmes handed it to me. The letter contained only 3 words. "Thank you, Mr. Holmes." I felt a chill run through me. Lestrade cursed under his breath. "Damn it all, Holmes. He's still out there." Holmes chuckled. "Course he is." He leaned back, folding the letter carefully before tucking it into the inside pocket of his coat. "A ghost can never truly be caught." Lestrade only watched. Strahd muttered a few choice words before grabbing his hat. "Well, if I hear even one whisper of his name again, I'll be the first to hunt him down." Holmes smiled. "Cam, and I shall be most interested to see if you succeed." "Cam." Lestrade scowled, tipping his hat as he left. I sat back in my chair, staring at the letter. "Do you think we'll ever see him again?" Holmes exhaled slowly, his gaze drifting toward the fog that curled beyond our window. "Perhaps. But tell me, Watson, if a man is dead to the world and yet still walks, is he truly gone at all?" I had no answer for that. The clock chimed softly. The fog pressed against the glass like unseen fingers, and somewhere, out in the vast and shifting darkness of London, Edwin Blackwood walked free. A legend never dies.